Hi everybody, my name is Erik Frits and welcome to this presentation about 7 steps to get started with Revit API. Also, I want to say huge thanks to BIM Coordinators Summit organizers for letting me present this to you. I hope you'll find this useful and it will encourage a few of you to pick up this new skill. This is probably not the first time you hear about Revit API. It's a very niche topic and it can be very confusing where to start. At least it was for me when I started. And I had to waste a lot of time on simple things because I didn't have any roadmap. But once you get to know Revit API, you realize that you could have learned it so much faster if you followed certain steps, instead of trying to build a massive add-in without even knowing where to start. Trust me, I've been there and it was frustrating. So my goal for this presentation is to give you a roadmap on how to get started with Revit API. Also, I want to explain you what does Revit API even mean. And I want to reassure you that you can learn Revit API with Python. You don't need to be a genius programmer or degree in computer science. You just need to learn the basics of programming to start using it. And then you can improve by creating more and more useful tools. So let me present to you how I would learn Revit API if I had to start all over again. But before we're gonna go through the 7 steps, I wanna share an interesting thought. Did you know that by creating a custom Revit add-in that would save you 5 minutes on a daily basis, you can save more than 20 hours annually? And now multiply this number by the number of colleagues in your office and you can get quite a number of hours that could potentially be saved. And what if you could create these dream tools for you and your office to save that time? And I'm quite sure that all of you have a few tools in your mind that would help you in Revit, and there are many that are quite simple to do ourselves. Just remember how many times you scroll through Revit apps wondering where is that feature, and you realize that it doesn't exist yet. And this is what's so nice about being able to create your own tools, because we can bypass software limitations and create it ourselves. I was also frustrated with Revit, so I decided to try to create a simple tool myself. I wasn't a good coder at the time, but I actually made a button at the time that worked. And it was a huge aha moment for me, because I knew that probably there are many other things that I could do as well. Since then, I kept learning more and more about Revit API and created even more tools. Eventually, I had a lot of tools that I wanted to share and I released EF tools. And thousands of people gave it a try and liked it. Also, you have access to every single line of code that I have written. You can use it for learning or take certain snippets and reuse in your own scripts. But you need to understand Revit API to take advantage of that. And that brings us back to the question, what is Revit API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. In simple terms, API is a documented set of instructions written by developers of an application to give us access to a program's functionality. For example, if we were to look at the wall class, you'll see that we can read its methods and properties and then use it in our script, but more about this in a moment. For now, let's actually go through these 7 steps to get started with Revit API. First of all, we need to learn some programming language to actually use Revit API. Then we need to prepare our development environment. Then we need to learn how to read and use documentation. Revit API is huge and we can't know everything, so every time you work with new classes, we need to reference them in the documentation to understand how to use them. Then selection is very important. Not only we need to select elements for many of our tools, we also need it during development to test certain snippets on our elements. And once you understand how to select elements, we can try to look inside of them. Start by exploring how to read different properties and methods, and it's not that complicated. The next obvious step is to learn how to work with parameters. Working in Revit is all about parameters. We store a lot of data and there are many parameters that control our geometry. So you should understand well how to get, read and set values in your parameters. Then the last step for beginners is to master getting elements. Revit is like a database containing all elements sorted by categories, classes and different parameter values. And we need to learn how to get specific elements for our scripts. Once you go through these 7 steps, you'll be slowly joining ranks of other Revit API wizards. You'll start to create quite a lot of simple tools for your office, and if you stick with it, you will be able to create even more and more complex tools that you need. So let's look at these steps in a little more detail. The first step was learn Python or any other programming language. You see, there are multiple languages available to access Revit API, but these 2 are the most popular ones. And if you're a beginner, I'll strongly recommend you to start with Python, and there are many reasons for that. You see, Python is much easier to learn than other languages, and it's also much more forgiving. Python syntax is also more readable, which means it's much easier and quicker to write code, and it's also easier to maintain it. It has a large and active community of developers, and there are many examples of using Revit API with Python, and I'm gonna show you where to find them. Also, there are plenty of courses available online. Just find the courses that you enjoy the most, and there are even free courses from tech giants like Google, Microsoft, MIT, Harvard, and many others. Just find the course you enjoy the most and learn from it. So you might be wondering, how can we use Python inside of Revit? You see, Python is not officially supported by Autodesk, but it doesn't mean that Python is lacking any functionality. We can use Python inside of Python nodes in Dynamo or by using plugins such as Revit Python Shell or PyRevit. Or we can even use it inside of Grasshopper if you use Rhino inside Revit. But if you decide to learn Python, I would actually start with following these steps. First, you need to understand what data types mean in Python. You see, in Revit, when we create a parameter, we can choose from the long list of different data types we can use for our parameters. And so does Python have different data types. And it's not so many of them. Then the next steps are variables. In Revit, we use parameters to store our data, but in Python, we need to declare a variable and assign a value to it, so later we can use it somewhere else in the code. Once you know variables, you can start looking at the operators, so you know how to manipulate them. There are different operators such as arithmetic, comparison, logical, membership, and there are also a few others that you will need to learn. After that, you can start to adding more logic to your scripts by using conditional statements. Conditional statements will allow you to make different tests. For example, you could write if X, then do this, else if Y, then do this, or otherwise do something else. And this will be the logical flow in your scripts for your algorithms. After that, explore how to use loops. Because when we're going to code in Python, oftentimes we're going to have a list of items. In this case, you can see I have A, B, C, D, and E items. And if I would want to iterate through this list and do something with each item individually, I would have to write for item in list of items, and then do something with this item. And this do something is actually a function. And this is the next thing that you need to learn about Python. Functions are amazing. You see, by this point, you'll be able to write some code and you will catch yourself copy-pasting all the time. And this is a really bad practice in programming. Because instead of copy-pasting the snippet, we have to create a function and then use this function. And even if there are some minor differences in your code, we can use it as arguments in function. So we have these differences accounted for. And then if you want to use it in multiple places, instead of copy-pasting the whole snippet, you're just going to call this function name and provide different arguments if necessary. And the best part is whenever you need to update it, you just need to update it in one place and not look for all the places where it was used. After that, have a look at modules and packages. Not only you need to understand built-in modules and packages, you also need to understand how to create your own library of snippets, which you can reuse across many scripts. You'll take your favorite functions and place it inside, and then you will use it across all of your scripts. And whenever you need to make any changes, you won't need to open each script individually. Instead, you would go just to your library and correct it there, and it will be affected in all your scripts. And the last thing you need to learn is object-oriented programming basics. It's all about working with classes, and while as a beginner you won't need to write many classes in your code, you still will need to work with a lot of classes in Revit API. You will need to learn how to access its properties, methods, constructors, and other things, which includes in object-oriented programming. And most importantly, you have to practice. Practice as much as possible, because the more you practice, the more errors you're going to encounter, and the more you're going to learn how to solve them. So practice whenever you can with Python. Now we're going to the next step. Set up your development environment. It can be broken down in two steps. We need to install Revit plugins and configure our IDE. IDE is like a text editor for programming. First, Revit plugins. We need to install Revit Lookup, Revit Python Shell, and PyRevit. This is the holy trio that you need for Python development in Revit. And for configuring IDE, we need to install Python and configure Revit API and PyRevit autocomplete. But more about this in a moment. Let's focus on the plugins first. The first plugin we need to install is Revit Lookup, and it's amazing. This allows you to look inside your elements, and you can see all available properties and methods of your elements. And not only that, you can actually see the actual values of your elements, and you can explore and understand what needs to be done in your code to access different values. It was developed by Jeremy Tamick and is probably one of the most used add-ins for Revit API development. It also has plenty of contributors on GitHub, so definitely install this first. The next plugin we need is Revit Python Shell, and it's interactive Python Shell environment within Revit. It allows you to run Python scripts inside of Revit and get instant results. I use it quite often when I need to test some new snippet or I explore new classes and what can I get out of them. It was developed by Darren Thomas, and there are a few contributors on GitHub as well. And the last but not least is PyRevit, and it's amazing. It was developed by Eshan Arenejad, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, and has plenty of contributors on GitHub, and it has a lot to offer. First of all, you will see PyRevit tab in your Revit, which has a lot of useful tools that you can use in your daily work. Then on top of that, you can install even more additional extensions by using PyRevit Extension Manager, including my EFTools extension. But the best part is that everything is open source, meaning you have access to the code of every single button in PyRevit and all additional extensions, and you can use it for learning or just reuse it in your own scripts. If you want to find the source code of any button, First of all, find the button that you are interested in and then hold Alt and click on this button. This will open you a folder where a Python file is located and you can open and inspect it further. Also, if you want to create an extension with PyRevit, it's super simple. We just need to create a folder structure with certain suffixes in the end, such as .extension, .tab, .panel, and .push button. And inside of a push button, we need to place a Python script, and optionally we can add an icon. And this is enough to show you tools inside of Revit as your own custom extension. Also, PyRevit provides you a lot of modules that can simplify Revit API access. Especially, I want you to pay attention to PyRevit Forms module, which has amazing library, which I'm gonna cover in a moment. But first of all, let's have a look at IDE. As I said earlier, IDE is a text editor for programming. Personally, I use PyCharm for my development, and it has a free version, which is more than enough for all of you. It looks like an image on the right, where you have a window for your code, and on the left side you have folder structure of your extension, where you also have your library, and it's very easy to navigate. To configure it, you would need to install the right Python version, then create virtual environment, and then install Revit API and PyRevit autocomplete. It's very simple to do. The next step, we need to learn how to read and understand documentation. Documentation is really important, especially for beginners. And in here, we not only need to learn about Revit API documentation, but I would also strongly advise you to explore PyRevit developers documentation, because it has a lot of written tutorials, and also it shows you a lot of snippets and what they do. Let's start with Revit API documentation. When you're going to select a Revit version, you'll see this menu on the left where you have a lot of different classes and namespaces. But normally we would use the search bar on the top. For example, I'm looking for the room class right here. Once I'm going to select the room class, it will open it up and I can explore its properties and methods. And there is a lot of information about how to use them and what is being returned. For example, let's also look for another method. Let's see how to create a wall by using create method. First of all, you will see the description. It tells you that it creates a new rectangular profile wall within the project using default wall style. Then most importantly, you will find syntax. And if you pay attention, you will notice that syntax is available in C#, Visual Basic, and Visual C++. As I said before, Python is not officially supported by Autodesk, but it shouldn't discourage you from using it, because it's very easy to translate any of the snippets into Python. Let's have a look at the C# snippet and let me explain you what's going on. First of all, public static, you can completely ignore it. Then wall represents what kind of type of element is returned by this method, and if nothing is returned, it's gonna say void. Then it says we call this create method and we need to provide 4 arguments, and you can see their names in orange. There's document, curve, level ID, and structural. And you can see their respective types on the left. They have to be document, curve, element ID, and boolean. Also, if you need more description about these parameters, you can scroll down and you will find a section about parameters and return values. But in this case, it's quite self-explanatory what's going on. Also, you can find some exceptions, but as a beginner, you shouldn't even worry about them, so just ignore it. And then, if you're lucky enough, you will be able to find Revit API examples. Normally, they're going to be in C# and other languages, but don't worry. As I said, it's very easy to convert it into Python. Here is Python translation of this snippet, and as you can see, it's very similar. We just got rid of C# syntax such as curly braces, semicolons, type hinting, and keywords like new for constructing. And then we are left with pure Python function. This is how easy it is to translate it. Also, you can just copy this whole snippet, give it to ChatGPT and ask it to translate to Python. And usually it does a pretty good job, but sometimes you're gonna see some errors. But it's very easy to fix them. The next is PyRevit documentation. First of all, you'll be greeted with this Get Started section where you have a few written tutorials and just explanation how does PyRevit even work. And also it has a lot of different pages on different subjects. And don't worry, I know it looks like a lot of information, but you won't need all of it. Most of it you just need to reference once and then you know how it works, but there are a few to which you're going to be returning over and over, especially this effective output and inputs. Let's have a look at them. Here you can see the content of effective inputs, and there are a lot of different forms available to us. Let's have a look at alerts. You see, with just a few lines of code, we can get this menu to our users and get notified that script was cancelled or any other text you want. Also, by using this alert, we can turn it into yes/no menu. Or we can ask user to select one of the options, and then based on this option, we're gonna run different scripts. And this is how it actually looks in PyRevit's documentation. You can see there are plenty of different snippets on the left side, and then you have actual forms on the right side. And you just copy paste it in your code, and it's just gonna work well. This is the best part about using PyRevit, because it's super simple. So the next step is selection, because selection is very important. To master selection, you would need to go to Revit API documentation and look for selection class. It tells you that it contains the current user's selection of elements within the project, but also we can modify it. Mostly you will be interested in selection methods, especially in get element IDs, pick elements by rectangle, pick object, pick multiple object, or set element IDs. And to start using this class, first we need to get an instance of selection. And here's a code snippet. On the top, we specify that it uses UTF-8 encoding for special characters. Then we import everything from Autodesk Revit DB and UI selection modules. And then we define the variable UIDoc. And by using this UIDoc variable, we can actually get an instance of selection, which we're going to be used for modifying our selection in Revit. Let's have a look at the methods. The first one is get element IDs. It's going to return you IDs of the elements that are currently selected within the project. Now let's have a look at the C# syntax. You can see that this is going to return you a collection of element IDs, and it doesn't have any arguments. So we simply have to call it on the instance of selection. And here's a code snippet how to do this. I still have my imports and defined variables, and then I use this get element IDs on my selection variable. Since it's returned you element IDs, I want to turn it into elements by using get element method. And this is the list comprehension that you can see wherever I doc get element, element ID, for element ID in selected element IDs. And after that, you can also filter it based on different types. For example, you can only filter to see selected walls or selected slabs or any other class or any other parameter that you want. Next, let's have a look at pick element by rectangle. It's also very easy to use. It has one argument, which is status prompt, meaning we just can write some text that user will see somewhere in Revit. And here is a code snippet on how to use it. We also get the selection instance, and then we call pick element by rectangle on this instance. And we just specify some text for the user so they know what to select. And it already returns you a list of elements, so we don't even need to convert anything. And the next, let's have a look at pick object or multiple objects. Here's the method in Revit API, and it's gonna prompt user to select one object. This one is gonna return you a reference, and it takes one argument, which have to be an object type. An object type is an enumeration in Revit API, meaning that it has all the possible values stored inside of it. So we just have to choose the right value for us. And in our case, we want to select element. And then here is the snippet. Same as usual, we get the same variables, and then I'm going to call this pick object on selection. And as an argument, I'm going to provide object type.element. Also, if you have Revit API autocomplete, this element will be auto-suggested. Then, since it's a reference, we need to turn it into an element. And we can use getElement method by providing a reference inside of it. And this is how simple it is to pick your object. And if you would want to use pick multiple objects, here's the method that we need to use. It's exactly the same, but it's only going to return you a list of references, and we also have to provide the same object type. So here's the actual snippet, and you can see that we do everything exactly the same, but in the end we create a list comprehension to turn the list of references into actual elements. And lastly, let me show you how to set your selection in Revit, because this one is quite useful. This is the method that we're going to use. You can see that it doesn't return anything, therefore there is word void in the beginning, and it takes one argument, iCollection of element IDs. And instead of iCollection, we can actually use list from system collections generic. Then we're going to get the same variables. I define a list of element IDs manually. Normally you would create some algorithm to select your elements. And then we turn this Python list into typed list by making list of element IDs. And we provide this list into set element IDs. This is going to change selection in your Revit UI. Now, once you learn how to select elements, we can look inside of them and try to read properties and methods. To do this, we can look inside of Revit API at all available properties and methods of different classes. But even better, you can select your element with Revit lookup and have a look inside of it. Because as I said, you can get all the properties and methods and also their values. And this will make it very clear for you what needs to be done to get certain values. Here's the code snippet that you can use. First of all, I'm going to pick an element, and then I'm going to try to get different properties such as ID, group ID, category name, category built-in category, and level name. And you can get even more, and I highly encourage you to do so. Once you understand how to read different properties and methods, we can try to work with parameters. In Revit API, there are 5 different types of parameters. We have project and shared parameters, built-in parameters, global parameters, and family parameters. First of all, you should focus on project and shared and built-in parameters, because they also share the same class and they're related to all the elements. If you're gonna look with Revit lookup inside your elements, you'll notice there is a property called parameters. And if you click on it, it's gonna open a new menu where you will see all your parameters on the left, and these are instance parameters. And then you can explore its properties and methods. Here's a code snippet where we can get all of the parameters, iterate for them, and then we can print each parameter definition name, definition built-in parameter, storage type, is it shared, is it read-only, and you can also read many other properties. If you want to get the built-in parameter, you will find built-in enumeration in Revit API. meaning it has the names of every single parameter inside of Revit, and there are probably hundreds, if not even thousands different parameters. But to easier find the parameter name, you can use the Revit lookup again. When you're gonna look inside of one of your parameters, like comments for example, you can look inside of definition, and then there's gonna be a built-in parameter, and it's always gonna be in capital letters and written this weird way like all model instance comments, and you will get used to this, don't worry. Then to actually get the parameter, for built-in parameters, we're gonna use getParameter method. And inside, we just need to provide built-in parameter and name of that parameter. And then we can even try to get the value, and for the comments it's gonna be a string, for example. And if you would want to get project a shared parameter, we need to use lookupParameter method, and we just provide parameter name. We could also use it for built-in parameters, but it's not recommended, because built-in parameter name can have different names across different Revit languages. Now let's actually have a look inside of these parameters. Here I'm gonna look inside of the comments parameter, and you can see that it has the storage type of string. Therefore, if I want to get a value out of this parameter, I should use as string, and in this case it's going to return me a text value. But if I were to look at some other parameter like area, you will see that the storage type is a double. Therefore, I need to use as double to get the value. But you will also notice that as value string returns me completely different value. And this is because all units inside of Revit API use feet, and as value string has already converted to whatever my project is set. But you should never use as value string for your precise calculations, because it's always going to be rounded and sometimes the difference is going to be quite big. So always use it as double if you want to calculate it and then convert to your metric system. Then if you want to set parameter values, we can use the set method, and it has 4 variations depending on the storage type. We need to provide double, integer, string or element ID, depends on your parameter. And here is a code snippet. Right here you can see that I take the parameter, use the set method, and provide new comment value. And you might also notice that I have to use transactions. Transaction is sort of a gatekeeper of your Revit projects. You see, as a beginner, you might be afraid to mess up your project and you won't be able to. Because whenever you will try to make any changes to your project, you will have to use transactions. You will have to start and commit your transaction, and all the changes have to be between these 2 statements. This way, we know that all the changes to Revit are made consciously and not accidentally. And last step is master getting your elements. It's all gonna be about one class, filtered element collector, and it has a lot of methods that are actually quite easy to use. Let's have a look at this filtered element category anatomy, and I know it's a lot of text, but I want you to focus right here. There are 4 steps to use filtered element collector. First of all, we need to define an instance of filtered element collector. Then normally we use either of class or of category, depending what kind of elements you're trying to get. Then the next step we would make where element is element type or where element is not element type, depending if you want to get types or instances of this kind of category or class. And lastly, normally I turn it to elements, but sometimes it might also make sense to turn it to element IDs. Let's actually have a look at some examples, because probably right now you're very confused. And here's the first example how to get wall types, and I know now you're even more confused, because it looks very long line of unreadable code, but it's actually very simple to use. Because most of the time it's all repetitive. If I were to get all roofs, you can see that I just need to change built-in category name, and also I need to provide where element is not element type. If I wanted to get rooms, I would write it like this, and this way I don't even need to write where element is or is not element type, because rooms don't have any types. I could also use of class to get my floor or floor type, and in this case, floor instance and floor type have 2 different classes, so I also don't need to specify where element is not element type. I could also combine of class and of category, it all depends on what kind of elements you're trying to get. So let's repeat it once again. We create an instance of filtered element collector, then we choose either of class or of category, then we choose where element is or is not element type, and then normally just turn it to elements because it's always easy to get your ID. And if it looks confusing to you, there is a simple way to learn it. You see, I have written a filtered element collector and filters PDF guide where there's 20 different pages explaining you all the concepts, and you can get it just for $1 on my website. In there, I try to explain as much as possible on how to work with filtered element collectors and filters. And my goal was to include as many examples as possible, so you will find a lot of code snippet, and you don't even need to understand it. You would just come here, choose what you need, and copy it in your script so it works. For example, you can see that there's a lot of different examples. Here I'm getting different views, and I can filter it by legend, sections, elevations, and whatever you want. Hopefully it will have everything that you need. And this was the last step, so let's summarize our roadmap to getting started with Revit API. The first step was we need to learn Python. Then we need to set up our Revit API development environment. After that, you need to understand how to read Revit API and Revit documentation. Then learn how to select your elements with Revit API and how to read their properties and methods. After that, you can learn how to work with parameters, especially you need to understand how to get, read, and set project and built-in parameters. And lastly, master getting your elements. And by following these 7 steps, you will be able to create a lot of tools for your office. And over time, you will increase complexity of your tools that you can create. And if you need help, I also have a YouTube channel where you will find a lot of different videos on this topic. Not only I create tutorials about Revit API, but also I show you how I create my own tools. So you can just follow me step by step, and over time you will start to understand more and more. If you want to find it, just look for Erik Frits on YouTube, and I'm sure you're going to find at least one of my videos. Also, I have a website, learnrevitapi.com, where you can join my newsletter, and soon I'm going to publish there my course, Learn Revit API. Currently, I'm finishing editing the first 6 modules, which were about 15 hours of recorded content, which I made into 5 hours of edited content. As you can see, I put a lot of effort in editing to make it as short and concise as possible. Hopefully you're gonna like it. And later I'm gonna add even more modules. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that you listened it until the end. And now if you have any questions, I would like to answer them.